Smell hit me first. Pine Sol and something underneath it, something older, like damp wood and closed windows and a house that had forgotten what fresh air felt like. I stood in the doorway of the home I had built from nothing, the home I had left in the hands of my daughter and her husband 12 years ago, and I stood there long enough that my carry-on bag slipped from my fingers and hit the floor before I even noticed I'd let go. My daughter was on her knees in the hallway. She was scrubbing the baseboard with a rag, a gray rag that had probably been white once. She had a bucket beside her, and her hair was pulled back with what looked like a rubber band, the kind that comes around a bunch of broccoli at the grocery store. She was wearing a faded house dress I had never seen before, the kind of thing you wear when you don't expect anyone to see you, when you've stopped caring if anyone does. She didn't hear me come in. She just kept scrubbing. I want to say I called her name right away. I want to say I rushed to her and pulled her up off the floor, but the truth is, I stood there for what felt like a full minute, maybe longer, and I just looked at her. I was looking for the daughter I remembered, the one who used to argue with me about staying out past curfew, the one who cried at every single graduation ceremony, her own and everyone else's, the one who once drove 4 hours in a snowstorm just to bring me soup when I had a bad cold. What I saw was a woman who looked closer to my age than her own. Her hands were raw, her shoulders were rounded forward in a way that told me they had been rounded like that for a long time. And when she finally looked up and saw me standing there, when our eyes finally met, there was a half second where she didn't recognize me. I watched it happen. I watched her brain try to place my face, like I was someone from a dream she couldn't quite remember. Then she said, "Mama?" and her voice cracked on the second syllable. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without the beginning. And the beginning starts 12 years ago in a kitchen in Shreveport, Louisiana, with a conversation I have replayed in my head more times than I can count. My name is Elaine. I'm 64 years old now. I was 52 when I left, and at 52 I had already spent 3 decades building a healthcare staffing company from a borrowed desk in a shared office space. I placed nurses and home health aides and medical technicians across the Gulf Coast region, and I was good at it. I was better than good. By 2012, I had contracts with 7 hospital systems across 3 states and a reputation that opened doors I hadn't even thought to knock on yet. When a hospital network in Houston offered me an acquisition deal that included a 5-year operational contract requiring my on-site presence in Texas, I was not looking to leave home. I had a house in Shreveport that I had paid off. I had a daughter, Vivian, who was 29 and newly married to a man named Scott, and I had what I believed was a settled life. Not perfect, but settled. Scott had charm the way some men have cologne. You noticed it before you noticed anything else about him, and by the time you started to wonder if it was too much, you were already used to it. He was a project manager at a commercial construction firm. He and Vivian had met at a mutual friend's wedding, got engaged 11 months later, married 6 months after that. Fast, but not so fast that I panicked. Vivian was not an impulsive person. She had her grandmother's steadiness in her. I told myself that counted for something. His mother, Carolyn, was another matter. Carolyn had the particular quality of some women who believe the world is arranged incorrectly and that they have been personally tasked with correcting it. She had an opinion about everything and delivered each opinion as though it were a diagnosis. She didn't like the neighborhood where Vivian and Scott were renting. She didn't like the way Vivian kept her kitchen. She once told me at a Sunday dinner that she thought I was too close to Vivian, as if a mother and daughter being close was a clinical problem requiring intervention. I didn't like Carolyn. I want to be honest about that. I didn't like her, and I didn't trust her, and when I left for Houston, I worried about that more than I let on to anyone. What I did before I left was this. I signed the house over to Vivian. The house I had paid off. a 4-bedroom colonial on a corner lot in a neighborhood where I had watched the property values climb for 20 years. By 2012, it was worth close to $800,000. I put it in Vivian's name alone, not Scott's, not both of theirs. Vivian's. My lawyer drew up the paperwork. I explained to Vivian what each document meant. I watched her sign it. I kept copies of everything in a fireproof box that I brought to Houston with me. I told her, "This is yours, no one else's. If anything ever happens, you call me." What I did not do was make it impossible for someone determined and patient to slowly make her believe it wasn't. The first 2 years, Vivian and I talked every week, sometimes more. She would call me on Sunday evenings and we would stay on the phone for an hour, sometimes 2. She told me about the garden she was trying to grow in the backyard, about the neighbor's dog that kept getting into the trash, about a cooking class she had signed up for with a friend from work. Normal things. Good things. Then the calls started getting shorter. I noticed it, but I told myself she was busy. She had taken on more responsibility at her job. She was a patient intake coordinator at a clinic. And she and Scott had started talking about having children. I told myself her life was filling up, and that was a good thing. That was what I wanted for her. What I didn't know was that every time we hung up the phone, Scott was there. And Scott had started saying things. Small things at first, I learned later. Comments about how much time she spent on the phone with me. Questions about whether I had asked her about their finances. Suggestions that I was checking up on her, not caring about her. That there was a difference. And Carolyn had moved in. I didn't find that out until much later. Vivian had not told me, and when I asked her once, directly because something in her voice had shifted, she said Carolyn was just staying for a little while, that Scott's father had health problems and Carolyn needed a change of scenery. She said it quickly, the way you say something when you have practiced saying it until it sounds normal. By year 3, Vivian had left her job. Scott told her she didn't need to work, that he was making enough, that she should focus on the house. By year 4, I realized I no longer had a cell phone number that worked for her. The calls were coming from the house landline, and only when Scott was at work. She never called on weekends anymore. I am not a fool, but I'm a mother, and I made the mistake that mothers make. I told myself the story that hurt less. I told myself she was adjusting to married life. I told myself I had raised her strong enough to speak up if something was wrong. I told myself she knew the door was always open. I was wrong. And every day I spent not driving back to Shreveport to check on my own child is something I will carry for the rest of my life. The operational contract in Houston ended in year 5, but by then I had built a regional office and the business needed me there. I extended. Year 6 became year 8, became year 10. I sent money every year. I wired it directly to an account I thought was Vivian's. I found out later it went into a joint account Scott had opened without fully explaining it to her, and that Carolyn had access to it, and that very little of it made its way to Vivian in any meaningful sense. The last time Vivian called me from the landline, she sounded tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. She said everything was fine. She said she had been having some headaches. She said Scott was keeping her busy. She laughed at something, but the laugh was small and it ended too fast. I asked her if she was happy and she said, "I'm okay, Mama." Not yes. Okay. 2 months after that call, the line was disconnected. I tried every number I had. I called Scott's cell phone 3 times. He picked up once, told me Vivian was resting and he would have her call me. And then he did not have her call me. I called the clinic where she used to work and was told she no longer worked there, which I already knew. But hearing it again from a stranger made something in my stomach go cold. I sent a letter to the house. I don't know if she received it. I am not proud of the next 18 months. I told myself I was waiting for things to settle. I told myself I was giving her space. The truth is, I was afraid of what I would find if I pushed too hard, and there is no version of that truth that doesn't belong to me entirely. What finally got me in the car was a letter from my property tax attorney. It was a routine notice, a copy of something sent to the house. But the name listed as a secondary contact had been changed without my knowledge. Someone had filed paperwork with the parish assessor's office listing Scott as a co-owner. It was not valid. Vivian's deed was clear. My lawyer confirmed it within an hour. But the fact that someone had tried it told me everything I needed to know about what was happening inside that house. I drove to Shreveport in one day. 9 hours. I stopped twice for gas. I did not call ahead. When I turned onto my old street and saw the house, it looked the same from the outside. The azaleas I had planted along the front walk were overgrown, but they were still there. The paint was peeling slightly around the shutters. The gutters needed cleaning. These were the things I noticed because they were easier to notice than the car in the driveway that I didn't recognize, a newer model truck, expensive, parked in the spot where Vivian used to park her Camry. I used my key. I still had a copy. Vivian knew I had a copy. And that is when I found her on the floor. I called her name, and she stood up slowly, the way a person stands when their body has forgotten what it feels like not to be tired. And when she was standing and looking at me and I could see her face fully, I had to work very hard not to show her what I was feeling, because what I was feeling was grief. Not fear, not anger, not yet. Grief. The kind you feel when you see something you love that has been badly mishandled. She was 41 years old. She looked like she was trying to disappear. She kept saying she was fine. We were standing in the kitchen and I was making her a cup of coffee. I had found the canister in the pantry and I was making coffee in my own house like a visitor. And she kept saying I didn't need to worry, that things had just been stressful lately, that Scott had been going through some things. She used the word things 4 times in 3 minutes, the word people use when they don't have language for what they actually mean. I asked her when she had last left the house for something other than groceries. She thought about it for a moment. A real moment. She actually had to think. "I'm not sure," she said. I asked her where Scott was. She said at work. I asked where Carolyn was. She said at a doctor's appointment. I asked Vivian to show me her bedroom. She hesitated before she led me down the hall. The master bedroom. My old bedroom, the room with the bay window I had specifically requested when I had the house built. The room I had painted a soft gray color that I had spent 3 weekends choosing had been fully redecorated. A large closet had been expanded into the space where my reading nook used to be. There was men's cologne on the dresser and a woman's reading glasses on the nightstand that were not my daughter's prescription. The reading glasses belonged to Carolyn. I picked them up and held them, and I put them back down very carefully. Vivian's things, her clothes, her books, the small watercolor print she had loved since college, were in the second bedroom. The guest room, her childhood bedroom. She had been sleeping in her childhood bedroom in her own house. I sat down on the edge of the bed. Vivian sat beside me, and for a few minutes, neither of us said anything. Then she started to talk. Not everything, not all at once. It came out slowly and in pieces, the way things come out when they have been kept inside for a very long time, and the person has forgotten how to say them out loud. But enough for me to understand the shape of what had happened. Scott had told her, over a period of years, that the house was as much his as hers, that my putting it in her name alone had been an insult to him as her husband, a deliberate statement that I didn't trust him, that I had poisoned their marriage before it started. He had said it enough times and in enough ways that she had begun to believe some version of it was true. When Carolyn moved in, it had happened the way weather happens, gradually and then all at once, and by the time you realize how wet you are, you're already soaked through. The joint account had been Scott's idea. He had told her it was more efficient. He managed the bills, he said. He had told her the wired funds from me were loans I had made to him for investment purposes, that he was building something for their future. She had not seen a bank statement in 4 years. She had not seen a bank statement in 4 years. I did not say everything I was thinking. I am 64 years old, and I have learned that the moment when someone you love is finally telling you the truth is not the moment for your own feelings. So I let her talk. I made her eat something. I found bread and eggs, and I made toast and scrambled eggs, and I made her sit at the kitchen table and eat while I stood at the stove, and I listened. When Scott came home at 6:15, I was still at the table. He stopped in the doorway to the kitchen when he saw me. The charm was there immediately, that instinct-level charm, automatic as breathing, and he smiled and said, "Elaine, we didn't know you were coming." "I know you didn't," I said. He talked for several minutes about how glad he was to see me, about how much Vivian had missed me, about a renovation project he was planning for the backyard, something about a pergola. He talked the way people talk when they are trying to fill all the available air so that no one else can use it. I let him finish. Then I told him I had spoken with my attorney that afternoon. I had called her from Vivian's childhood bedroom while Vivian napped, and we had been on the phone for 50 minutes, and she had walked me through every option available to me and to Vivian under Louisiana property law. I told Scott that the deed to this house was in Vivian's name and had always been in Vivian's name, and that no filing with any assessor's office and no verbal agreement and no amount of rearranged furniture changed that fact. I told him that the joint account had been reviewed by a forensic accountant I had retained 2 weeks earlier, because the property tax letter had given me enough warning to make some calls, and that the findings were being compiled into a document that would be very useful in a number of future conversations. The charm went somewhere else very quickly. Carolyn came home 20 minutes later. She walked into a kitchen that was no longer the kitchen she had been operating as her own. She looked at me. She looked at Scott. She looked at the expression on Scott's face, which was no longer charming. I looked back at her and I said very calmly, "You're going to need to find somewhere else to stay tonight." What happened over the following 6 weeks was not simple. I want to be honest about that. Nothing about extracting someone's life from a situation like this is simple, and anyone who tells you it is has never had to do it. Vivian had to agree to the divorce. She had to decide she was ready to do that, and she had to get there herself. I could not get there for her, and I had to accept that. There were mornings she second-guessed herself. There were nights she cried in ways that had nothing to do with Scott specifically, and everything to do with the years she had lost and the version of herself that had been worn down so gradually she hadn't noticed it happening. But she got there. My attorney filed for divorce on Vivian's behalf. The financial recovery process was slow and required documentation I had to help Vivian reconstruct piece by piece. Account statements, wire transfer records, the paper trail of every dollar that had come into that house and where it had actually gone. Scott had an attorney. His attorney was not as good as mine. Carolyn's doctor's appointments, it turned out, were not medical. I found that out later, and I am including it here because I want the full picture to be visible, not because I take any satisfaction in it. She had been meeting with a real estate attorney to explore options for converting the property to a joint ownership structure. Those conversations ended. The divorce was finalized 11 months after I walked back into that house. Vivian received a settlement that included the full value of the marital assets Scott had accumulated during the marriage, assets largely funded by the money I had been sending for over a decade. Scott moved to an apartment in Bossier City. Carolyn went back to where she had come from. I don't know, and don't ask. Vivian still lives in the house. I know some people think she should sell it and start somewhere new. And I understand that thinking, but the house is hers, and she knows it now in a way she maybe didn't when it was only a name on a deed. She planted a garden this past spring. She has a therapist she sees every Thursday. She laughed on the phone last week, really laughed, about something small and stupid, the way you laugh at things that don't deserve a big laugh but get one anyway. I had not heard that laugh in so long I had to sit down when I heard it. I am still in Houston. I go back to Shreveport every 6 weeks now, and sometimes Vivian comes to me. We are rebuilding something. It is not the same as what we had before, and I am not going to tell you that it is, because that would be a lie, and both of us have had enough of those, but it is real. It is ours. And there are mornings when we sit on the back porch of that house with coffee, and the yard is quiet, and the light is coming through the azaleas, and I look at her, the roundness gone from her shoulders, her hands wrapped around her mug, her face turned toward the sun, and I think, I almost didn't come back in time. I almost waited one more year. I almost told myself one more time that she would call if she needed me. If there is anything I want someone to take from this, it is not about Scott, and it is not about Carolyn. People like that exist and will keep existing, and no amount of warning prepares you for finding them in your own family. What I want you to take from this is simpler than that. When something feels wrong about the person you love, when the calls get shorter and the voice changes and the words are fine, but the weight behind them isn't, don't wait. Don't decide that the love you have for them means they will come to you. Sometimes the love you have for them means you have to go to them. I went, late, but I went. And my daughter is planting things again. I have had a lot of time to think about what happened, not just what Scott and Carolyn did. That part is actually the easiest to understand, because greed is not complicated. Greed is just hunger that never learned to stop. What I have spent more time sitting with is the part I played, not in the way that punishes me, but in the way that teaches me something I needed to know. I built everything in my life through discipline. I got up early and worked late and said no to things that felt good in the short term because I could see further down the road than the immediate moment. That is how the business got built. That is how the house got paid off. That is how I put Vivian's name on a deed when she was 29 years old, because I had the foresight to protect her even before she needed protecting. But foresight without follow-through is just planning on paper. I planned for the legal part. I did not plan for the human part, the part where a person you raised and love and trust can be slowly convinced that her own reality isn't real. I did not account for what patience and proximity can do to a person's sense of themselves. Scott and Carolyn did not break Vivian all at once. They did it the way water shapes stone, consistently, quietly, over years. And I, who loved her, was 9 hours away telling myself she was fine because the alternative was too hard to look at directly. That is the thing about intelligence. It can protect you from a lot of things, but it cannot protect you from what you have decided not to see. I am an intelligent woman. I built a company from borrowed office space. I read contracts before I signed them, and I trusted my instincts in business more times than I can count. And those instincts were usually right. But intelligence without honesty is just a more sophisticated way of fooling yourself. And I fooled myself for years about my daughter because I did not want to make the drive and find out I was right to be worried. There is a version of courage that looks loud, the kind where you fight back, where you call the attorney, where you stand in your own kitchen and tell a man that his name is not on this deed and never will be. I had that courage when I needed it. But the courage I wish I had found sooner is the quieter kind. The kind that makes you get in the car before you have all the evidence. The kind that says, something is wrong with the person I love, and that is enough reason to go. Vivian is rebuilding herself now. She is doing it the way my daughter has always done hard things. Without drama, without bitterness, one Thursday therapy appointment, and one garden bed at a time. She is resilient in a way that belongs entirely to her, and not at all to me. and I am careful not to take credit for it. What I gave her was a house and a deed, and eventually an attorney. What she gave herself was the decision to keep going. What I know now is that the three things worth building in a life are not the things you can put in someone's name. They are the capacity to act honestly when honesty is costly, the wisdom to stay curious about what you might be getting wrong, and the endurance to continue after you have made the mistakes you could not avoid making. I had to find all three of those in myself before I was of any real use to my daughter, and she had to find them in herself before she could use what I brought back to her. That is the whole of it, really. You build what you can while you can. Then you pay attention